right, time for another chapter of The West Beyond the West. This is chapter 2, uh, The Trade in Furs, 1789 to 1849. The dreaded fur chapter, which I guess for all Canadian school children, it's like, oh, you got to get through the fur trade, and it's often pretty dry and pretty like, oh, chapter. Actually, this actually went pretty good for me. Maybe I'm a more mature young school child. Number two is maybe that Gene Barman did a good job of kind of connecting this to the history of British Columbia. That really at this point in the history, for the Europeans incursion coming in, this is definitely a chapter about the Europeans. Who definitely depended on the native peoples for supplies and actually to get the furs, and they were often kind of, they're canny people, the natives who were dealing with the rather wild bunch that was the sometimes a very unprincipled bunch of the people that are going in here. This is primarily about the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, the two kind of competing factors in here, except basically within the span of this time between 1789 and 1849, sees pretty much the trapping out of all of these regions. The fur, at least as economically viable, to the near extinction of a lot of the things. The sea otter, primarily above them. Indeed, things get so tight that the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company combine, so that there is only one monopoly in here, and is put under the command of George Simpson. This is also when you get the names of, there was a search for sea routes, primarily kind of going from Hudson's Bay down to the Pacific coast, or at the very least finding routes that they could navigatable rivers that they could ship goods, because basically going through the Panama Canal was controlled by the Spanish. The Dutch controlled the Cape of Good Hope. They're really desperate to find something else. So this is where you get a couple of very familiar names. Three Northwest partners: Alexander Mackenzie, the Mackenzie River; Simon Fraser, the Fraser River, and also now the university; and David Thompson, are these guys who got sent to try and find routes. Indeed, there's a thing in here where Fraser, unfortunately, he's trying to trace the Columbia River, but unfortunately finds his own river, the Fraser River, which turns out to be a complete failure. Can't navigate it. They actually even kind of they really kind of argue against this. They establish Fort Langley at the mouth of it in hopes that they're going to be able to get up it, but pretty soon figure out that they can't. That gets set aside, and we end up going to Fort Vancouver, which even that is less. See, even that is sort of not really satisfactory as a place, as seen by Simpson, who ends up moving it north because he's worried about all the territorial disputes with the Americans, and worries that that might get sucked in, so that they end up putting the new fort 240 miles north on an island, on Vancouver Island, in Victoria, which is where I am standing today. So yes, we get George Simpson in 1821. George Simpson, nicknamed the Little Emperor, was what would be today termed as an efficiency expert. As early as 1826, he was being commended by the Hudson's Bay headquarters in London for his, quote, distinct business-like arrangements and indefatigable zeal and perseverances in making yourself a master of all the minute details as well as the general arrangements of business. They were all about the profits, these companies, which, makes sense as companies, but they were only interested in profits. They were only interested in, returns for their partners. While they were British interest, they weren't interested in extending British sovereignty to the area. That only comes later. But yes, so the construction of Fort Victoria began in 1843. In 1841, Simpson made the crucial change in the Pacific Northwest fur trade by ordering Hudson's Bay Company headquarters moved farther north. Simpson never much favored Fort Vancouver and still considered it of questionable economic use. Fort Vancouver realized no profits worth mentioning. So you see what the drive is here for these fellows. There's some interesting stuff here about the natives' role in the fur trade extended into personal relationships. So such as Indian leaders such as Carrier Chief Quan, who lived between 1755 and 1840 near Fort St. James, established close ties with a handful of the Europeans stationed across New Caledonia. Simon Fraser received much needed foodstuffs from him, about a dozen beavers and a few rabbits. Qua reminded Harmon of his equality with Europeans. Do I not manage my affairs as well as you do yours? You keep your fort in order and make your slaves, meaning my men, obey you. When did you ever hear that Qua was in danger of starving? When it is the proper season to hunt beaver, I kill them. I know the season when fish spawn, and then send my women with nets which they have made to take them. I never want for anything, and my family is always well clothed. His leadership is indispensable, particularly in securing the 30 to 40,000 salmon needed annually to feed the men stationed across New Caledonia, which is what they were calling this area. So they were provisioning all the fur traders and stuff like that. And it was 1828 when Qua supposedly saved the life of James Douglas, then a young fur trader. 5 years earlier, local Carrier had killed 2 Hudson's Bay clerks on discovering that one of them was having sexual relations with a woman the Indian considered his property. The Indian hid in Qua's vacant house, which as a chief's home was in Carrier tradition a sanctuary. Not knowing, or possibly not caring about the tradition, Douglas, in his capacity as chief trader at Fort St. James, entered the house and killed the man. I think this kind of gives you an impression of the very much kind of just, justice gets dealt out right there and then by these traders. There is no legal system around, or at least not one that they obviously respect, like the native legal system that would have been around. Qua on his return led a gathering of outraged carriers to HBC post. His nephew drew a sword and asked permission to kill Douglas, but Qua made it clear that he only sought an explanation. At this point, the women at the post, including Douglas's young mixed-blood wife, apparently began throwing gifts at the Indians in compensation. Qua convinced his men that satisfaction had been obtained, and they went quietly home. But the understanding went only so far. The Hudson's Bay Company blamed Qua as intermediary, and for several months he was not allowed to return to the post. So we are already getting that kind of uneasy kind of what's the power dynamic, and as soon as the power dynamic shifts decidedly to the non-native, how that is going to get taken advantage of. It's actually interesting. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see if Barman gets to it later, but I was reading Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk, which talks about a lot of the toll of disease that happens to the native population, and that hasn't been mentioned here yet. Even though I know from Daschuk's book that basically whenever there's more incursion of white settlers, fur traders, that into areas that they are bringing disease, and that's having devastating effects on the native population. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened on the prairies. I would not be surprised that I'm pretty sure that that is exactly what's happening here, but it's not being mentioned yet. We're just getting the straight kind of fur trade story without what's happening to the population, except for, I think, in Fort Vancouver, they talk about how native population is ravaged by a malaria outbreak that had happened there, and thus there weren't necessary people there to actually be able to supply furs to the fort. I wonder if that is actually native malaria, or if that is malaria brought in by the Europeans. Not a question that is answered here. There's a lot of stuff here about how Simpson's really tried to make everything. He was nickeling and diming, he was squeezing out every penny he could get out of this area to make it economically viable, which, I mean, I guess from a white colonist viewpoint was a positive thing, because then, well, is the reason why we're probably here. I'm Canadian. Is that this made it economically viable for these British companies to be in this area versus abandoning it and it being taken over by the Americans. It wouldn't have gotten left for the native peoples. Unfortunately, it was just a matter of exactly which colonist power was going to come in. There's definitely very much the thing of noting in here that when they're deciding, we have the election of Polk and him 54-40 or fight was, this was, then, yes, Polk swept into office. Tensions between the United States and Britain escalated. In 1846, it began to look like military hostilities might break out off the Oregon coast. Then, as was repeatedly the case in British Columbia's history, we already saw this with the War of 1812, which is actually more of the European War, a compromise triumph. On the 15th of June, 1846, Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Washington, by which neither country obtained all its territorial claims. The boundary between the two nations was placed at the 49th parallel, as far west as the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, then southerly through the middle of said channel and of Juan de Fuca Strait to the Pacific Ocean. This gave all of Vancouver Island to the British. Property south of the border, including Fort Vancouver and Puget Sound farms, was to be respected until it could be sold at a fair price. Oh yeah, and I have to remember there's the two Vancouvers. There's Vancouver as in Vancouver, BC, and then there's Vancouver as in Vancouver, Washington, which is probably the Fort Vancouver we're talking about there. Puget Sound farms was to be respected. Britain retained navigational rights along the Columbia River on the same terms as the Americans. By the Treaty of Washington, the United States acquired all the territory lying south of the Columbia River, the existing Oregon Territory. It also obtained the area north of the river to the 49th parallel, still home to only a handful of Americans, together with Hudson's Bay men and native peoples, which in 1853 became the Washington Territory. So, it wasn't considered equitable, but it was clear that the British priorities were not centered on the Pacific Northwest. They were, growing free trade sentiment in Britain meant that colonies were no longer simply assumed to benefit from the mother country in the vague name of imperialism, but were judged on their profitability. It's one of these things again of Britain was they were getting out of the kind of monopoly of the kind of like grabbing everything. They wanted the cash, but not necessarily property. So that is this section. It's very much, the fur trade. It's like even as the physical entity that would become British Columbia was receiving official acknowledgement, the fur trade that spawned it was in retreat across the Pacific Northwest. Some fur trades continued, but the role as the sole basis for the European interests in British Columbia had passed. Land-based trade, initiated by the Northwest Company and consolidated under the Hudson Bay Company, had held sway in the Pacific Northwest for half a century. With the assistance of Indians, peoples, explorers, and traders, had slowly penetrated the interior Pacific Northwest. Indirectly, a British presence was established. Europeans, albeit in tiny numbers, were now resided year-round in the future province. So this is where got the European powers have that toehold in the Pacific Northwest. The Americans down below, and the British up above. Um, you know, although the HBC was like, as a mercantilist monopolist creation, in practice it was served its own economic purposes rather than those of the British Crown. Um, by the mid 1820s, Spain and Russia had lost interest in the Pacific Northwest. That's players dropping out. George Simpson, head of the HBC, was concerned to protect the HBC from possible American threat, and not, as it must be stressed, to use the HBC as a bulwark to counter that threat on behalf of Britain. The decision to move principal trading post north of the Columbia River and then to Vancouver Island represented economic response to changing political realities. Simpson's policy was essentially short-term, intended to increase profits. They put it up. They put it up in Victoria because they could smell the wind blowing, that things were going to get chopped in such a way that Fort Vancouver down below Vancouver, the American, was going to become the American. Without the trade in furs, Canada might well have lacked a Pacific coastline, and the province of British Columbia not existed. So that is the reason why, as a British Columbia school kid, I got to suffer through much of the fur trade, though it was much more focused on the voyageurs trekking across Ontario, Quebec, and that way than it was the Pacific trade, because of the old ancient textbooks that we read that were, I swear to God, from the 60s or 70s, while I was in like the 80s. At least they seemed that old of textbooks. So it was interesting to read something that is now as old as that was, but is well written, and was a peppy chapter. Just kind of, it zipped along, and I was able to read it in an afternoon, which is sort of probably what I'm looking for, that amount of detail of whatever my interests are in this period. Actually having kind of, little stories and stuff like that from the thing are interesting. It'll be interesting to see if Barman kind of does dwell more on kind of the native experience, because yes, as I said, from Clearing the Plains, I know that there's things freaking horrible for native populations at this time, with the influx of disease, even as, at least at that point with the fur trade, they were able to kind of be kind of more equal partners because of the fur trade. Now, as the economies shift, if it's anything like Dasychuk, native populations are going to get shoved to the side, and the European colonists will start sucking the resources out of lovely province. Beautiful British Columbia. More videos later. Oh, and yes, just for the little my little thing, impetus to settlement, 1846 to 1859. So this is probably why do, at this point, there's only a tiny number of Europeans in British Columbia. Why do they come? Why do they come? Could it be gold in their hills? Perhaps. All right, more videos later.